Okay, good morning everyone and welcome to session 13 of the local planning examination. A few housekeeping matters. First of all, in the event of the fire alarm sounding, please exit via the main staircase you came up or through the staircase which is accessed from the room on the opposite side of the landing and assemble at the front of the building. I'd ask that any mobile phones are switched off or turned to silent whilst we're in session. The proceedings are being broadcast by a webcam. The webcam is above the door where you came in, and it's also linked to the microphones. So I'd ask that those speaking make sure that they speak into the microphones and make sure that they're turned on when you start to speak and turned off when you finish speaking, because only one microphone apart from my own can be on at one time. Now, today's session is concerned with alternative sites which have been suggested by representatives. These are sites which are not included in the local plan, but others are seeking that they are included or are added either in place of sites which are already in the plan or in addition to them. I'll just read out the relevant couple of paragraphs from the agenda for this session for the benefit particularly of the webcam, so that people understand the role of these hearings in the process. Alternative site proposals are unlikely to progress any further unless I conclude first that there's a shortfall in the development proposed in the plan, or that proposed developments in the plan are unsuitable, meaning the local plan is unsound as submitted. In that event, I'm likely to refer the issue back to the Council to consider whether they wish to identify alternative development sites to address the soundness issue. Now, before any site were to be recommended for inclusion in the plan, there needs to be further public consultation on the associated proposed modifications, with an opportunity for representations by interested persons. So I'm conscious that, that other persons who might be interested in the effective development on these sites so far haven't had an opportunity to make any comments about them, but would do in the event that they were proposed to be added to the plan. So the purpose of this hearing and any associated written statements which were submitted in response to the questions I've circulated in advance provides an opportunity really to establish whether there is sufficient information available to inform the site selection process, and it gives me a kind of overview of what alternative possibilities might be generally around the borough if additional sites were needed. So as I say, I've circulated an agenda with a series of questions, standard questions for each site, and there are 4 of these sessions on alternative sites, and this afternoon, this morning, this afternoon, and tomorrow morning, tomorrow afternoon. And we've also had a previous extra session which looked at some other sites. And later on, so written statements have been submitted in response to the questions which were set out. And later on this morning, we'll also be looking at some of the policies for countryside, for the countryside and concerning housing outside the settlement boundaries defined in the plan. Right. So I'm going to go through the sites in the order in which they're set out on the participants list. This morning, all the representations have been submitted by Mr. Peter Court on behalf of a number of different individuals, landowners and development companies. And so we'll go through them just one by one and pick up some issues with them as we go along, and the Council has an opportunity to respond to any matters which have been raised in the written statements. The Council has also submitted a schedule of relevant information about each of these sites, particularly in relation to in relation to the questions put on and what the site's present status is, and in some cases where there is some planning history associated with them. Okay. So the first site I'm going to look at is at Langley Heath. This is Green Lane, Langley Heath. And let's get the relevant Okay. This concerns a large area of land to the west of Green Lane, but the proposal is that only the frontage of the site on Green Lane be developed for housing. There's the possibilities that the other land is available for other purposes if required, but the housing, we're concerned here with the possibility of housing on the site frontage. Actually, I will just do, before we get into discussion, although I know that everyone, I think, here knows who everyone else is and all familiar, just for the benefit of the webcam, we'll just do the introductions, go around the table so that people are aware who's here.
Good morning. Rob Jarman, Head of Planning and Development at Maidstone Borough Council.
Good morning. Richard Timms, Principal Planning Officer at Maidstone Borough Council.
Good morning. Adam Reynolds, Planning Policy Officer at Maidstone Borough Council.
Morning, sir. Megan Thomas, Barrister for Maidstone Borough Council.
Good morning, sir. Peter Court, Planning Consultant, Peter Court Associates, on behalf of various landowners and developers.
Okay, thank you. And for those who don't know, I'm Robert Mellor, the Inspector. Okay, so we have this site. This is so Langley isn't one of the villages identified with a settlement boundary as for development. Although obviously other parts of the parish are proposed for major development on the edge of Maidstone. So this is a site with essentially it's infilling between two areas of development on the west side of the lane. Now let's have a look at. And from what I've seen, this is essentially quite a lane of quite rural character, with quite narrow, with hedges along the frontage. Does the council has in relation to potential constraints on development here, say it's basically a greenfield site. They consider there's the landscape impacts. Potential for protected species in this area. They say a small area of the site may be in flood zone 3. In other words, there's a risk of flooding, and the potential adverse highway impacts. Does the council just expand a bit on that and sample where the flood zone is and what the protected species, the landscape and impacts and so on may be?
Thank you, sir. I think they're quite general points that are being made in terms of the landscape impact and the consolidation between the development to the north and the south. And in terms of protected species, it is just to indicate that there is the potential for protected species on the site.
What sort of, I mean, is this just because it hasn't been surveyed at all? Or
yes, yes, it's not specific. There's no survey to indicate precisely what those are, but it's an indication that that's potential on the site. In terms of the highways impact, I think that this comes from the SHLA, where the Highways Authority made reference to Green Lane as a single carriageway road with few passing places, but they didn't object to the particular site. And I think loss of the hedge potentially on the front is also a potential landscape impact, and obviously can have implications for ecology. One point I wanted to just draw attention to for this particular site was an appeal decision, which I have copies of,
okay,
which is to the northeast of Langley Village. This was from February 2015, and was an outline application for 15 units.
50, 50.
15, 1-5.
1-5.
The point I wanted to draw attention to was, and this goes to the village not being within the hierarchy, it's the sustainability, where the inspector said the village has benefit of a bus service that runs to Maidstone. However, the service is limited frequency, refers to the limited services in Langley being a doctor's surgery and village hall, and basically concluded that in the case of that development, it would be a car-reliant development and wouldn't be in line with the sustainable development aims of the NPPF. And as I said, so I've got a copy of that decision here. But I think that goes, although that's just to the northeast of the village, which must be 200, 300 metres away, I don't think this site's any better connected on the southwest side of the village.
Is it close to bus services on the 274, for example?
Marginally closer, but you're still walking down Horseshoes Lane and northwards from the site on roads that I wouldn't say are ideal for walking along.
Okay. Mr. Court.
What we've heard from the Borough Council are basically general points about there is potential for ecological and highways and flooding problems. There's been nothing specific. Those points have been made as a sort of a general blanket approach. They're points that don't concern me for the very good reason that my clients have an extensive piece of land here. I've suggested to them that they promote basically frontage development as shown on the plan. There is plenty of other land behind. That land could be made available to an appropriate organisation such as the Parish Council, the Borough Council or a housing association should there be a need for land for whatever purpose. And if we do have a constructive conversation along those lines, then obviously detailed surveys of ecology and other matters can be undertaken. So we have flexibility here, sir. It's not as though, as I often say to clients, you're trying to squeeze a quart into a pint pot. There is, we can have a flexible approach, and the plan I've submitted is for indicative purposes only. I think the amount of land being shown is appropriate given the form of the existing built-up area around it, but we are open to discussion, certainly. There's another general point that Mr. Timms has brought up, which applies not just to this site, but to a number of sites that we'll be discussing today and tomorrow, in that the council's strategy is to concentrate on sites within and on the periphery of Maidstone, and then in 5 rural service centres, and then in some larger villages as well. That, in my opinion, sir, is a reasonable strategy. I don't have any problems with that. It's the same strategy as adopted by a number of local authorities. But development stops at the larger villages. There is a plethora of smaller villages in the borough, Langley, East and West Farley, and plenty of others, Grafty Green as well, where there are absolutely there's no development at all. And given the fact that I consider that, or a number of objectors consider that Maidstone is still short of housing and it doesn't have a 5-year supply, there is potential for limited development at settlements smaller than what the council call the larger villages. And indeed that strategy is supported in the NPPF, where it states that in certain circumstances a number of villages can help each other in that one provides one sort of services, others provide others. And so maybe a collective approach can be taken to them. So whilst Mr. Timms is absolutely right, there isn't the full array of services here. Yes, there's a village hall. Yes, there's a doctor's surgery. Yes, it's on a bus route. It doesn't have everything, and I wouldn't pretend it does. But I'm concerned that by having a blanket approach to development outside anywhere smaller than a larger village, the economy and the health of these villages will suffer. So I think modest development at an array of smaller settlements would actually be useful, it would actually be beneficial. So that is really the stance, and that is really why I put this site forward in the first place. I have explained the situation to my client. He's fully aware of it, and I consider that this site is worthy of promotion in terms of its positioning, its impact. It isn't contravening any policy, any strong policy of restraint, and therefore I think that given the need for some housing, some limited housing in places like Langley Heath, this site is certainly worthy of consideration.
Mr. Jarman.
Just to amplify a couple of points that Mr. Timms raised, to my mind, there's clearly a large gap between two built-up areas, the one to the north, sort of Langley proper, much larger than the one to the south. And that gap, to my mind, is integral to the character and appearance of the countryside. And as Mr. Timms pointed out, and as opined by an inspector, it's clearly an unsustainable location.
Yeah, you didn't amplify on the flood zone point. Is that relate to the red land or the blue land? I mean, it just seems obvious from here where the flood zone might be, but I notice there's a pond just outside the north west corner. I wonder if it's just in that area. Yeah, so it's not wouldn't necessarily affect the housing. What's being proposed as a housing site now.
Beg your pardon. We don't think that the actual housing site will affect the flood zone.
Yeah. Okay. Right. I don't have any more questions on this one, so I think we'll move on. Okay, the next one, this is a more unusual proposal. This is Cripple Street, Maidstone. Now, there was this confusion on the which site it's referred to, and the original statements submitted under this number related to a different site at Lenham, of which, however, there isn't defined, well, there's no site was defined in the original representation for Lenham, for that site, and so I don't think it can be taken into account as a duly made Regulation 19 representation for that specific site. This is the site to the south of the railway near Ham Lane. But I think there's a misunderstanding as to which site it did refer to, but the reason this site was put on the agenda originally under reference R1999 is because there is a duly made representation for this site at Cripple Street in Maidstone, and Mr. Court has just submitted his written statement in relation to this in response to questions, and the council, that's a site which the council had identified in its own schedule as the relevant site here. And the proposal is just fine. Well, I'll ask Mr. Court just to, describe what is being proposed for this site.
Thank you, sir. This site was originally proposed for residential development, but really, following the council's decision to abandon proposals for a park and ride in the vicinity of Linton Crossroads, some distance for the south, my client considered that his site would be appropriate to provide for a park and ride. So I was instructed to promote it on that basis, and he also employed Peter Brett Associates, highways consultants, to undertake a substantial amount of detailed work on the highways implications. So we have made submissions to that effect, sir, and we also had a pre-application meeting with the Borough Council earlier this year, but it was then made, at that point, it was made pretty clear to us that as this was an area of outstanding, I beg your pardon, as this was an area of local landscape importance and it would lead to development, it would be unacceptable, which we take a different view because, and as we discussed not so long ago at this inquiry, sir, when we really talked about transport and specifically about park and ride, I made a number of points then. I don't know to the extent you wished me to reiterate them, but safe to say that the council doesn't really seem to have a park and ride policy. Its draft local plan, the Reg 18 one, had a pretty reasonable policy listing the 4 park and ride sites together with criteria should any others be promoted. We've now gone down to just 2 park and ride sites and no criteria at all in the park and ride policy. As I said to you on that occasion, sir, this isn't a policy. There are other policies in the plan, DM 24 and 25, that talk about support for public transport, but they seem to have been written in isolation. So there is a matter of principle here, sir. My clients believe that there is a need for further park and ride facilities. The one on the 229 at Armstrong Road was removed not so many years ago. The fact of the matter is that under this plan, the council is adding some 18,500 houses to the borough of Maidstone, and it's reducing, or its park and ride facilities have been reduced from 4 to 2, which seems to run counter to the need to invest in transport facilities, public transport facilities, and to reject the idea of a park and ride in this part of Maidstone was something we found very difficult to comprehend. And so that is the reason why, sir, we have promoted this site, because we genuinely believe there is a requirement for one. Now, the site in question is in Cripple Street. I did send you a map showing the site.
Yeah, I've got your original Regulation 19 Associated report as well. That's showing a scheme for, I think it's two alternatives here. One for 500 parking spaces and 20 residential units, and one for 550 spaces and 16 residential units.
Yes, that was work undertaken by Peter Brett, sir, but the map I sent you shows that my client's site that's been identified, or we have identified for a potential park and ride, is approximately 6 acres. There is a plan outlined in red, I believe. Yes. You have.
That's the same size, is it?
Yes, sir. Yeah. My client also owns the land outlined in blue, which runs all the way down to the Lewes Valley, and we know that there are local concerns about conservation in the Lewes Valley, but how should I put it? If we're going to have a park and ride facility on my client's land, then a conversation could always be held with Parish Council, Lewes Valley Conservation Society, Borough Council about what other protective works would be needed. I don't know whether any of those organisations would want to acquire some land. It's a discussion that we've never had. And the other thing on that particular map I sent you, sir, and I don't think it's come out particularly clearly, is that the land to the north was shaded yellow. I don't know if you can see that, but the land...
Just about, yeah. There's two hatchy area, there's two...
That's it, yes. There's two fields there, both of approximately 5 acres, sir. The one nearest to my client's site has been one on appeal and is under construction by Millwood Designer Homes. The one to the north of it is an allocation in the draft local plan, and not shown beyond that, the large white area beyond that is a development by Taylor Wimpey, Hale Place, that stretches right across from east to west.
What's that in this area, is it?
That's that area, yes,
Yeah.
sir, that's it. So basically, the western edge of that part of Maidstone has moved out quite significantly. The geography has actually changed since the last local plan was adopted. So my client's land doesn't actually stick out. It is very much in keeping with certainly what is there to the north and to the west. So on that basis, sir, we consider it is a reasonable proposal to promote a park and ride there, given that the land itself is area of local landscape importance. Now, I know when we discussed this matter, I think just about 2 weeks ago, you asked whether it was now landscape of local value. And I made the point that Jacobs had been commissioned by the Borough Council to assess landscape quality around Maidstone. They did so. They excluded this land from needing to be covered by a restrictive policy, which upset councillors. So councillors decided, against the advice of Jacobs, that this land would also be landscape of local value. So that's a politically imposed constraint rather than one based on professional assessment. So that, sir, is... I've tried to set the scene there. I don't know if I've answered all the questions you want, or I'm happy to answer anything else, but I think that provides really the context for a discussion about this site.
Was the land to the north in the area of landscape importance? I'll just ask the council about that.
I believe it was, yes. It was all of that land was landscape importance, but I said the most northerly, or the northerly site there is an allocation.
Yes.
The site below it, which is currently being developed by Millwood Designer Homes, was promoted, and it was proposed as an allocation by officers. But members decided they didn't want it due to local pressure, so that was dropped. Millwood promoted it, took it to appeal and won, and have recently started on site. So an independent inspector obviously thought that that land too could be reasonably developed for housing.
Okay. Ms. Timms.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on the developments to the north. The allocation H124, I was the case officer for that application, and I'm aware of the site to the north that was allowed at appeal. I think the differences between those sites is they do have some development to the west, and from my experience of when I've been to the sites, they're not as prominent as this site to the south. So whilst it will develop westwards in line with those, I don't think the context is the same. I think this side is more prominent, sitting as it is on the side of the or the top side of the Lewes Valley. I've got no specific comments on the Jacobs work, but nonetheless, it is being taken forward as a local landscape of value, and the conservation area, the Lewes Valley Conservation Area, is part of its allocation. It's quite a large conservation area. It is its landscape value and not just the buildings within it. So it's certainly, I would say, an area, a valley of landscape value.
Sorry. So Lewes Valley conservation area or the local landscape value? Which are we? Right. What's the difference between those? I haven't seen a plan showing where the conservation area is. Well, actually, I've got one here. Actually. What I've seen here, the conservation area excludes H124 sites, includes the appeal sites, and the. So this is the. I'll just show this. Yeah. Interesting. This is a document I don't actually have. Which I think I need, because at the moment I'm having to do all my policies map reference from the website, which is not very easy. And the area of local landscape value then covers H124 and the appeal site and the Taylor Wimpey site. So they're all within it, yes, as well as the site we're looking at now.
I think you may have said the appeal site's within the conservation area. No, it's on the edge.
Oh.
Would you like us to show you?
Oh, I see. Sorry. Yes, I understand, because there's a kind of dark red line, the conservation area.
Can I show you this plan, sir? This is the adopted plan.
Actually, just come over here while we're looking at this so we can see what.
The easiest way to do things.
Yeah.
That is the Taylor Wimpey site that we were referring to. That one.
So the Taylor Wimpey site was in the adopted local plan, right?
The site to the south, that is the allocated Postley Road site.
Right, and that was in the landscape importance.
Yes, the green and white stripe
Adjoining
is
the conservation area. Yeah.
The brown line here is the conservation area.
Yeah.
So that goes outside the allocated site.
Yeah.
It goes outside of Millwood Homes site, that's one on appeal, and it also avoids my client's land. So the conservation area is to the west of my client's
So it doesn't abut your client's land then, the conservation is further down the hill, down here, right? Okay.
If I can just carry on, sir. I mean, I said earlier that we're aware that there is a conservation area there, and Mr. Timms has talked about our site being prominent or lacking landscape controls, but the fact is, if we are going to develop it, then some form of landscape buffer assessment can be taken place in discussion with the Borough Council, in discussion with the Lewes Valley Conservation Society. It isn't the case that we would simply build a park and ride with a hard edge. Obviously, we'd expect some a landscape strategy and indeed a landscape management plan to be, not imposed, agreed. And as I say, there is quite a conversation that could be had about the rest of my client's land. So it is, at least he does have a large area of land which we could discuss.
And in relation to the housing element, so that would be, is that as indicated on the Peter Brett, being along the eastern edge of the site, adjacent to the existing housing area, is that the?
That's right, sir, yes.
With a separate kind of access?
Yes, it would be on the eastern side, more adjacent to the existing built-up area. And of course, I should add that there is the public right-of-way up there as well, and my client has been in conversations with the Kent County Council public right-of-way officer, because he believes that he can do something to improve walking and cycling between the Lewes Valley and Maidstone, and was particularly pleased when invited to have discussions with Kent Right of Way. Unfortunately, local people didn't think so, and there was a report in the local paper from them about their arguments saying this would be a scar on the landscape. They don't want it. So at least...
the development or the right-of-way improvements?
The right-of-way, the people concerned about the right-of-way, which leaves, I think, my client and indeed the County Council in a difficult position trying to improve transport and accessibility through walking and cycling, and local people coming out against it. But that's where we are.
Just in relation to the Park and Ride proposal again, there's another consideration obviously is this would involve traffic using the Cripple Street junction on the A229, which has been, has come up before in relation to the Boughton Lane developments, and has that in the Peter Brett evidence, how is that dealt with? Or?
Well, the fact is we don't have a dedicated bus lane, so I mean we discussed that the other week, and I honestly, I'm not a highways engineer. I think there would be considerable problems creating one. But the fact of the matter is that Park and Rides often run without bus lanes. The one from the eastern side of Maidstone, that's based in Moat Park, that runs westwards into Maidstone, it only has a bus lane for about 100 yards near the new cut traffic lights.
Yes,
and there are plenty of other Park and Rides where you don't have bus lanes. I must admit it makes life difficult, but I've travelled on the Oxford Park and Ride, and that doesn't have them. Surely it isn't a killer situation. I know it would be easier if there was a bus lane, but let's be honest, there's plenty of Park and Rides in the country without bus lanes. As I said the time before, the value of them is that you at least take people out of their cars, which I think it's better to have sort of 20 people on a bus than 20 cars going into town. It reduces pollution, congestion, it frees up parking space in the town centre. So there are advantages, despite the fact there is a lack of a bus lane.
So I wasn't thinking specifically about the bus lane, I was thinking more about the movements at the Cripple Street junction traffic lights and the capacity of those. Because you obviously have not only the buses but the cars itself that are using the Park and Ride.
I find it difficult answering questions on that, so those are really specifically for a highways engineer, and all I could do is refer you to the Peter Brett report.
Well, is it addressed specifically in here? I'm just looking at, I'm trying to find something about that.
Well, all I could say in that respect, sir, is that if you decided to suggest to the Borough Council that a Park and Ride in this vicinity would be appropriate, or at least should be subject to serious consideration, then I'd see that as an appropriate basis on which my client's consultants, the Borough Council and the County Council could work together to see precisely what was needed.
Yeah, I think the reference I can see in the report is acknowledging that the Cripple Street junction is a capacity at peak times and there's congestion. Also refers to Wheatsheaf, this is in relation to air quality. And I can see that the air quality benefits in relation to or the congestion or air quality benefits potentially in relation to Wheatsheaf junction and beyond, but the Cripple Street junction will still have to cope with all the traffic from the Park and Ride route as well. But okay. So, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, sorry, just a detailed point. Is there a record of the discussions with KCC Highways on this specific matter?
On the matter of the right of way? That's what, yeah.
In terms of, as I understand it, as you pointed out earlier, Sir, Kent County Council have strong concerns about the capacity of this junction, and it's linked up with the Wheatsheaf junction itself. It operates as part of the same system. So clearly it's an important issue. And I was just asking, where's the record of the presumably detailed discussions with KCC Highways?
My client employed Peter Brett to undertake the requisite highways work, sir. I wasn't party to those discussions. I've been doing the planning side of these things. If Mr. Jarman would like me to send him another copy of the Peter Brett report or even talk about it, I'll be happy to meet him and discuss it, just to clarify some uncertainties he has.
Well, I mean, we've got the Peter Brett report in the evidence, because that was submitted with Regulation 19. But the specific question was whether there'd been any discussions with Kent County Council, I think, about a park and ride car park at this site.
I would have imagined there would have been, sir, but I say I can't put my hand on my heart, and without the Peter Brett report in front of me, I can't give you gospel truth on that.
Yeah, I can't see any references here to that. I mean, can I ask you to, basically to ask Peter Brett that question? Yeah, I think. Just on this matter of this policies map, I mean, it would have been useful to have had the policies map earlier. I wonder if I can keep this copy. I think I'd also appreciate a copy of the existing local plan policies map, so I can see where the changes have taken place. And do you have the appeal decision from the adjacent land to the north? Yeah. Did the Council have any comments specifically about the housing element of the proposal? I mean, I'm taking it that your client is only interested in it as a combined scheme, housing and park and ride scheme, or?
Yes, the housing element was looked at, obviously, to part fund and finance the whole thing. But again, this isn't an absolute requirement. This is really a basis for a discussion.
So you say it's not an absolute requirement, is it?
That's my understanding, is that, okay, there can be some housing, but because, as I've already said, there is a need for housing anyway, and given the fact that development has been allocated to the north and then granted on appeal to the north, there is a demand for housing, and what better place to put some new housing but next to a park and ride? It's, this is integrated development. But again, the actual numbers are something that can be subject to discussion at a later date.
So I'm just trying to understand this plan, because the only plan I have for the housing is in the Peter Brett report. figure 1 says 500 spaces and 20 units, but as noticed on the plan itself, it says 27 units. Yeah.
I can't comment on that, sir, I'm afraid. But again, this is something that could be subject to, I think, a serious discussion should you decide that park and ride facilities here should be further investigated.
Yeah. And your statement says 16 to 20 as well. So is this one of the sites you're suggesting as self-build? Was that the...
No, the self-build element on this was my client did also make representations on land at Lenham. And, in fact, I have got with me the representations he did make about Lenham, which specifically talks about his land south of the railway. But there, the risk of jumping ahead, that is more of a medium-term proposal, and my client is very concerned about the need for, or rather opportunities for, self-build and other forms of housing, rather than simply sell the site to a developer and say, get on with it. And that's why he hasn't, unlike other developers at Lenham, put the land in hands of developers or actually promoted it through a planning application. So he is taking, I think, a very benign and benevolent look at what is actually needed there. And so that's where the self-build assessment or self-build reference came in, sir.
But do the same considerations apply in Maidstone, though, in terms of self-build? Sorry,
do you mean self-build on this site, yes, or self-build in general?
Well, I mean, I was just saying, if your client is recognising that, suggesting self-build is a possibility at Lenham, then they own the land here as well.
Yes, that's a possibility, certainly.
Mr. Gentleman.
Yeah, just quickly. As officers, we'd assumed that a housing element was integral to this proposal. Just a very detailed point, and I may well have now got this wrong. On figure 2, it appears to denote single units of housing, but they seem incredibly large. So, are they supposed to denote single units? It's just a detailed point.
That is an indicative plan, really looking at the capacity of my client's site, showing what could actually go there. But as I say, if this proposal was advanced, then obviously we'd need to sit down with the County Council and with the Borough Council to talk in detail about exactly what could go there in terms of built development. And as I said earlier, also in terms of landscape buffer planting and elements such as that.
So just looking at the way some of these are arranged, is there some intention to leave open gaps between the houses to maintain views from the ends of the roads? Is that?
No, I think that plan, sir, is very much an indicative plan it's really a first study, if you like. It's really to promote the principle of park and ride and to give an indication of the capacity of the site, and it goes no more than that.
Mr. Chairman?
Yeah, it just seems to me that I can see this is an indicative layout, but it would seem in figure 2 that, as Mr. Court has clarified, the housing shown illustratively are not single units. I presume they're sort of blocks of semis or terraced houses. I would have thought then the potential is way over 16 residential units. I would say it'd be more like a minimum of 50. Again, it's a very detailed point, but and I understand that this is indicative, but we'd have some concern about people living literally next door to a park and ride site.
Your park and ride sites currently close about 6:30 in the evening, aren't they? So
yeah, that's true. With design, there just would need to be a little bit of a buffer between the two, because I'm just familiar with. I take your point. Park and ride sites tend to, shut fairly early evening, but there's still issues with noise from traffic and lighting as well, because the lighting, in my experience, doesn't always shut off at 6:30 in the evening.
Perhaps need better timers. Okay, we'll move on then. Right. It's land at South Lane, Sutton Valence. Let's have a look. This is 1996. Right. Okay, this is essentially a field on the kind of back lane between the two parts of the village. Let me spell out. Just a minute. 1994. Got one missing on here. Down to that. Just a minute. A second. So I just noticed on the council schedule there's an extra site which isn't on the. Oh, I see. Yes, the Four Wents Orchard site, that's got planning permission. Is that withdrawn or is it?
You're right, sir. The Four Wents Orchard site was one on appeal fairly recently.
Yes.
And therefore there is no need to promote it with you today.
Okay, so we'll go straight to the. Because it was on the council schedule, but I think it must have been on an earlier version of the agenda. Okay, so South Lane, this is a 2-hectare site. And proposed 33 dwellings on the southern part of the site with open space on the northern site and 40% affordable housing. Ms. Scott's commented on the sustainability appraisal, which he says has underestimated some of the facilities in Sutton Valence, because he didn't mention the facilities including the post office, the doctor's surgeries, and other shops and facilities. And then I think the only site allocated in Sutton Valence is in the kind of the new part of the village to the south. Okay. Okay. Is there anything else you want to add before I ask the council to respond on this?
Just by way of background, sir, Sutton Valence was identified by the Borough Council as a larger village. But funnily enough, they didn't allocate any housing sites there, which came as a surprise to the consultants doing the sustainability appraisal. That, I think, really led a number of developers or landowners to promote sites. As we've heard, the Four Wents Orchard site has recently been one on appeal. My clients also promoted this site. The site, there's an allocation there. Wealdon Homes promoted the site called Brandy's Bay, which is further to the south. And that was actually granted on appeal, following which the council decided to allocate it.
The appeal came before the allocation?
After they granted permission in December 2015, it was then allocated in the plan, as I understand. But so there is only one site that actually has permission in a larger village. And as you've seen in my submitted report, sir, there's a very good array of services in Sutton Valence. The Brandy's Bay permission or allocation is in a special landscape area, like my client's site. But when you look at Maidstone's allocations, there are 68 allocations in all, of which 16 are special landscape area. So I hardly think that the council can object to developers promoting land in the SLA if nearly a quarter of its allocations have that designation already. My client's site, I think, is certainly closer to the core of the village and the facilities than Wealdon Homes site. It is, I think, a well-designed site. It isn't all housing. There is a substantial chunk of open space that actually comes between the proposed housing and the doctor's surgery to the north. I think it is, or I and my clients think it is a modest-sized proposal. It is reasonable for a village of this size. So I always advise clients when they come to me as to what I think their prospects are. Believe me, I've told plenty of clients, don't bother. These aren't worth promoting. They often don't like it, but that is a fact of life. I give clients my professional opinion. And on this situation, sir, I certainly said that I think this site could be reasonably promoted.
Page 36, sir.
Yes, I thought it was. I thought I found it. Oh, there we are. Yeah, got it. Right, so the site isn't in the local landscape value then?
And we're not aware of any appeal either. On this site, I think, Mr. Corbett.
Not on this site. He said that the allocated site was previously allowed an appeal before it was allocated. Was that the?
Yeah, Brandy's Bay.
Your microphone's not on. Sorry.
I beg your pardon. We weren't aware of an appeal, but we'll check again.
No, I think there's some confusion. I didn't say there was an appeal on Brandy's Bay. I was talking about the site that you referred to in opening, sir, the Four Wents site, which isn't being promoted here because that was one on appeal. That is up at Chartway Street, at the other end of the village. That was one on appeal, I think.
So saying, sorry, the sequence of events then, you say, was that the was a Regulation 18 plan had no allocations for Sutton Valence, is that right? Right. So they identified as a larger village, but with no allocations. And you're saying the allocation came in later, Brandy's Bay. Is that one? Okay. And you're also seeing the allocation was made so that the first thing that came along was the appeal decision at Warmlake, and then the allocation came later.
No, the appeal decision at Warmlake came, I think, in earlier this year. What I'm saying is the Wealdon Homes site, which is now the Brandy's Bay site, just to the south of this, that was actually permitted in December last year. And I think my understanding is that it was then allocated. It was obviously being promoted at the same time, but I think the permission actually came.
So it wasn't an appeal. It was permitted by the council, right? Okay. Right. Okay.
Is it okay to make a few points while
Yes.
Mr. John is checking? Yeah, thank you. Again, drawing attention to an appeal decision once more, which is just to the west of this site from May 2015, and again, I'll pass you a copy shortly, sir. This was a development for 12 dwellings. It was a detailed application that was dismissed. And just picking a couple of points that the inspector made, and essentially it's between this gap from the village settlement to the north, and I think it's the harbour to the south. The inspector says, whilst the site would be located between two parts of the village, there are still areas of open land within the area. In this case, the appellant suggested it was suburban in character, and the inspector felt that it was a rural character with open fields, sporadic and limited development, which retains the generally open appearance of the area. I think one quite key point, this was in terms of the setting of the conservation area, which I would say this site is within the setting of conservation area, but clearly it could be designed differently. But I think the point here is that the inspector felt the differences in land levels from the appeals site and the harbour compared to the conservation area underline the visual importance of how the older part of the village fits into the wider landscape, providing a key characteristic of this part of the local landscape and forming part of the conservation area's significance. And the open nature of the gap between Sutton Valence and the harbour invites observers to imagine visiting the village when it was most likely surrounded by open farmland and scattered developments, much as this gap continues to do so in its present form. So I think that was grounds for the council refusing that application. I think the inspectors agreed that the gap between the northern and southern is very important, and that was reasons for dismissing the appeal, which is essentially adjacent to the site to the west.
So is that the kind of the field opposite on the other side of South Lane?
That's correct.
Mr. Court.
My client's proposals, sir, do provide a gap.
It's one for the Purton officer there.
Sorry, sir. My client's proposals do provide a gap between the harbour development and the main core of the village to the north. In fact, my clients abut the harbour development, and they will provide an area of public open space to preserve that gap. And looking at the plan in front of me, my client's site is some considerable distance from the conservation area. So I wouldn't have thought that impact on the conservation area would be a reasonable ground for refusing this.
The conservation area is here, isn't it? This is the conservation area boundary.
Yeah.
And your client's land is here, isn't it? And it's here.
Yes, I'm looking at the adopted plan, so, and obviously I still consider that...
Sorry, look at settlement boundaries. The conservation area boundary is up here, yes. It's further up. The southern part of the the old part of the village isn't in the conservation area.
No, that's correct, sir. Basically, the conservation area runs pretty well along the main street, east to west.
Down to here?
Yes.
To this
Yes.
area.
Yeah, but broadly, that is the old medieval street through Sutton Valence, and obviously the conservation area broadly follows that, but it is some considerable distance from my client's site.
Mr. Timms, yes.
Yeah, just a point of clarification on the Brandys Bay site. That was in the Regulation 18 consultation from October 2015.
Okay.
Can I just ask for clarification? Was it in the earlier consultation, Reg 18?
There
Because
were two Regulation 18s, weren't there?
That was the point I was making, sir.
Right.
The first Reg 18
Yeah.
consultation draft identified Sutton Valence as a larger village but didn't have any allocations.
No, not in the 2014 Regulation 18 consultation.
Right, so sequence of events was the first consultation that identified Sutton Valence as a larger village but without allocations. Then, in autumn 2015, or later that year, there was a planning application at Brandys Bay, and the site then was added to the Regulation 18 consultation, or the second Regulation 18 consultation at the time, and permission was granted.
Sorry, I'd have to check the dates when the Wealdon Homes application was submitted.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Well, if it was granted permission in the December, we're probably looking several months before that.
Okay. Right. Now the other, and a couple of, I think we've dealt with the other constraints on the site. Yeah. The landscape we talked about, the minor ecological impacts. This is the general issue about developing on greenfield sites in the countryside. Yeah. Within 100 metres of a watercourse. Okay.
So if I may just...
Yes.
I think we've got the dates on the Brandys Bay.
Mm-hmm.
Application received 10th of October 2014. 2014.
Mm-hmm.
Decision made 1st of December 2015. So I suppose between submission and decision, it went into the Regulation 18 consultation.
Yeah, sorry,
Yeah.
sir. Yeah, we accept that Sutton Valence as a village is relatively sustainable because of its services. But as I also pointed out, you know, the conservation area, you know, is a very high value architecturally and particularly historically. And also, particularly with regard to this site and the appeal site, it is Sutton Valence Hill. It's at its steepest point, and that is integral to the setting of the conservation area. So, with on the one hand, yes, we do think Sutton Valence is a sustainable settlement, but there's also the challenge of these constraints as well, and this is why, yes, it is one allocation, but it's a big allocation, 40 units at Brandy's Bay, in what we think is one of the least sensitive parts.
Right, move on then to land adjacent to Old Goods Yard, Lenham. Now this is, obviously we've several times now discussed the Lenham and the broad location, and there's been this move in which the council is no longer opposing the principle essentially of development south of the railway at Lenham, where this site would be, and this adjoins the appeal, the Site 1 appeal at the Old Goods Yard itself, and would extend to the road to the east, south of the railway. But nevertheless, an outline plan application was refused by the council in October. Now, have we got the... Where's that? And the reasons for refusal, the development would erode the openness of the countryside, resulting in severe harm, fail to conserve natural beauty of the landscape, contrary to policy in V28. The current plan conflicted with MPPF in relation to the character beauty of the countryside, failed to demonstrate not resulting in ecological harm. There's no legal mechanism to mitigate harm and secure benefits. Okay. So I suppose that some of the position is that the council let's look at that. Does that work? I'm trying to understand this, the plan. What's the red line and what's the blue line? And why do they overlap? Yes. Ms. Timms, you want to come over?
The red line is the permission that was granted on appeal from
Right.
Old Goods Yard 1.
Mm-hmm.
The blue line is the site that has recently been refused by the Borough Council.
Right. Okay. So it would be an extension to the red line.
It's effectively an extension. We call that Old Goods Yard 1 and that Old Goods Yard 2. It is approximately a 40-unit extension that was refused.
Right. Okay.
And which is going to appeal.
And so I take it the council's position then is that they've refused that, but would they accept that it could come back as a broad location, part of the broad location, as and when the neighbourhood plan or local plan review or development plan document decides how it should be distributed. Yes, in fact, that's what they say in there. In the schedule, it's not located in accordance with the settlement hierarchy at the moment, but it will be reconsidered as part of the Lenham board location. And so, Mr. Court, I take it essentially you consider that it shouldn't wait for the board location. The site should be allocated now because of the need for housing.
As I said last week, sir, I welcome the Borough Council's move from resisting development at Lenham until 2026, which I thought was an absurd approach, given that they're looking to build 1,500 houses here. So I genuinely welcome their move to acknowledge that these could be brought forward. I am still very reticent about the willingness of the council to accept any development south of the railway. That reticence is based on the experience we had when we were promoting Old Goods Yard 1. We had a site meeting, whereas in response to every question I asked, I was simply told it is south of the railway, no go. I discussed that with the parish council, who also advocated development there to the borough council, and they were told exactly the same thing. We are not having development south of the railway, so we won it on appeal, and an appeal with costs. And the inspector's comments on that make very interesting reading. The reason why Old Goods Yard 2 was refused is still very much a hangover from Old Goods Yard 1. The council don't want development south of the railway. They really see development as going east and west and not south of the village, and this is why I've promoted the broader area south of the railway. And I mentioned earlier, sir, the representations I put in on behalf of David Knight, Hollyridge Services, who owns the adjoining land, the land adjoining Old Goods Yard 2. We're very fortunate there because we have just basically two landowners who do get on and speak to each other and liaise with the parish council, who control all of the land between Oldham Lane in the west and the Headcorn Road in the east. And indeed, I know that my clients have produced an initial broad master plan for all of the development south, for all of the land south of the railway, which we'll be pleased to share with the Borough Council. But as I also pointed out at an earlier session, the Council did have a discussion, a public meeting in April, and their consultants published a report.
Your microphone's gone off.
That they published this report on development, which showed how you could get 1,500 houses in, which included a fair bit of land south of the railway. Mm-hmm. And at the meeting we had here, session on October the 12th, I asked the council why they hadn't actually consulted on that. And Mr. Fullwood's reply was that he didn't want to upset the neighbourhood plan process, and local people were concerned about the impact on the AONB. Now, the fact of the matter is, sir, that the land south of the railway is most distant and shielded from the AONB. So you can still see the problem we face. The council officers are doing everything they can to resist development south of the railway and are fighting that tooth and nail. Why they haven't consulted on that draft plan, I don't know. Why, given their recent, and I say most welcome change of heart, why they haven't invited us in to talk about this in more detail. But as I said, I am now preparing an appeal, a heavyweight appeal, on Old Goods Yard 2 against the council. Now we can get rid of that if they want to seriously talk, because whilst my clients have submitted this application, the land to the west is owned by David Knight of Hollyridge Services, who is happy to take a longer-term view. As we said earlier, sir, he is the one who is quite happy to wait. He's interested in self-build housing and other developments of a community nature. There is a lot of development to go at Lenham, and it really needs master planning, but at the moment it is going to be one on appeal on a piecemeal basis. We've started at one end. Jones Homes have started at the northern end of the village on the A20. Wealdon Homes have got an outstanding appeal there now. So there is the opportunity for the council to really grasp the nettle and talk seriously to the landowners about a long-term, a short, medium and long-term plan. We're happy to do that, but the fact that they have refused permission on Old Goods Yard 2 really leaves us no opportunity to progress the appeal, but we are open to hearing from them, because obviously the time and the cost of an appeal can be very, very expensive for both parties, as they know. So we seem to be very slowly moving in the right direction, but as I say, we have an appeal about to be launched, and officers are personally died in the wool set against development south of the railway, which in my opinion is the obvious place to go, and indeed it has been identified by the neighbourhood plan. Now, parish councils, as you appreciate, aren't generally the most proactive people at promoting land for development, but when the parish council says the land south of the railway should really be developed, if I was with the borough council, I would seize that opportunity and say, let's work with these people, because we can then say that we've gone along with what they said. So that's really where we are, sir. This area south of the railway, from Oldham Lane to Headcorn Road, is a major area of opportunity. It's in just 2 ownerships, and it really begs to be developed, because it is the one place you cannot see from the AONB. But that's really where we are.
Yeah. I mean, you said that master planning of the area is needed, and you know, these individual proposals are kind of inimical to that. And we've heard before in Lenham that there are some particular infrastructure matters. I mean, not only the wastewater, but reference also being made to how you access the land south of the railway, and whether you need to widen or improve the bridges, particularly to the west. And there's the measures of contributions to new school and so on. All of which suggests that you need to have ways of spreading the infrastructure costs. Well, first of all, identifying what you need exactly, and then spreading the costs around all the development rather than having it come forward in a kind of piecemeal fashion. And I can see that if we're only dealing with a proposal for development south of the railway, I can see your argument that you could get on with it, and in relation to the lack of impact on the AONB. But the exploratory work, and there's still an issue because exploratory work is still showing areas to develop north of the railway as well, which remain controversial, and part of this local plan examination process has to address that overall issue before they can really get further on with the neighbourhood plan and any other way of proceeding with it. Mr. Jarman.
Yeah, just a general point. More than happy to have discussions with Mr. Court. And just for your information, I was due to meet up with Lenham Parish Council last Monday, I believe, along with one of the borough councillors, but due to ill health on the part of one of the parish councillors, the meeting didn't take place. So, to a large degree, I accept what Mr. Court said. Yeah, let's get on and move this forward. But I want to see a master plan move forward rather than piecemeal development.
I mean, can you provide any reassurance to Mr. Court that it isn't the case that you're just still opposing in principle development south of the railway?
Well, I'll need to repeat what I've just said, but I don't know if there's any comfort. But for instance, obviously we don't accept any development as per the Jones Homes application, which we refused very recently, the one at the top of Ham Lane on the western side.
You did, of course, allocate the Jones Homes site. So.
It's a greenfield site like this site, and unlike the site that you did win at appeal, a classic brownfield site.
The point I'm making, sir, is that land south of the railway is the most distant and shielded from the AONB. The council have allocated and then deallocated land and allocated and promoted land or accepted promotion of land east and west of the village in full view of the AONB, but still has a very strong reticence to development south of the railway. And I'm still not, Mr. Jarman didn't actually answer your question as to whether he was happy in principle with development south of the railway. I mean, once he's acknowledged that, I'm more than happy to go and meet him. But at the moment, it's we've basically had the door slammed in our face.
I think that's a bit extreme, Mr. Cord. I'm not against the principle of development to the south of the railway line. And I do accept, if one looks at things in two-dimensional terms, it is clearly the furthest area away from the AONB. But as you pointed out, sir, you know, there are other challenges. They may well be overcome. There's particularly pedestrian connections getting over the railway line because the village centre is to the northeast of Lenham. That's one of the issues, but in answer to your question, both questions, is no, I'm not against development to the south of the railway line in principle.
Okay. Right, I'll suggest we have just a morning break now for 10 minutes until 22:12, and then we'll resume. Okay, thank you. Okay, if we can resume, we've got slightly out of sequence on the participants list there. So I want to go back to 1989, wind chimes, Chartway Street, Sutton Valence. There's been an appeal hearing last month. Is there a decision been issued on that yet?
No, it hasn't, unfortunately. So you're right. Yes, we've had the appeal hearing. I was hoping to be able to give you the result by now, but it will be here, as they say, any day. Although we did have a letter from the Inspectorate on Friday asking what we thought of the council's affordable housing policy, to which I've just replied. So. I'm sure it'll be out fairly soon. So
is that because of the change in the threshold size? Is it?
Yes, it's all to do with the West Berkshire decision. We've been asked for our comments on that. So I don't really know how much time you want to give to discussing this. It's
well, I say we've got quite a few more to discuss, and I'm not sure there's going to be very much value in looking at this particular one. Okay. Right, Staplehurst, the Grange, land at the Grange, George Street, Staplehurst. This is the site north of the railway. Now, I think, but now the council doesn't want development north of the railway in Staplehurst. It's, okay. Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay. And you said that the neighbourhood plan did propose allocation at one point and then took it out again. Is that
yes, sir. This is, I think, a very bitter pill as far as my clients are concerned. They have worked long and hard to promote their site through the neighbourhood plan process. It wasn't a case that they stick an application in and hope for the best, but they have spent, I think they've been to pretty well every meeting of the parish council and local plan group ever since they started. And their site, which is north of the railway line but very, very close to the station, has been extensively promoted through the neighbourhood plan system. Mm-hmm. It had substantial support in the first two drafts of the local plan, and then they understand that the borough council didn't like it, so persuaded the neighbourhood plan group to take it out. But which is incredibly frustrating, but let's consider the location of the site. It's very close to the railway. There is a substantial amount of development at Staplehurst north of the railway. There's well over 100 houses there. There's a whole range of businesses that go up to Cross at Hand. There's farm shops, there's an old age person home, there's Homely Timber, there's quite a lot. Staplehurst doesn't end at the railway, and this site is very adjacent to it in what we consider is a sustainable location, and unfortunately permission has been refused, so an appeal is being prepared. But it could have been so different. If the council had accepted the site, then it could have gone through on the neighbourhood plan as was proposed, and the story could have been different.
So what is the what's the council's position on what happened with the neighbourhood plan then, Mr. Timms?
Sorry, is Mr Cord saying that it was an allocation, or...
He said it was in a draft version of the plan, and then it was taken out, and he says it was taken out because the Borough Council objected to it.
No, I certainly don't recall it ever being a site in a Reg 18 or certainly Reg 19 local plan.
Sorry, we're not talking about the local plan, we're talking about the neighbourhood plan. It was in the first two drafts of that, but dropped because basically the council twisted the parish council's arm.
Mm. But on what, if that was the case, on what grounds would, you know?
I'm simply not aware of that.
The fact of the matter is that my client's site was identified in the first two versions of the neighbourhood plan, and then it was dropped, and my clients asked the parish council why, and were told it's because the borough council didn't want it in, because it wasn't allocated in the local plan, and they didn't want this divergence between a local plan and a neighbourhood plan. So basically, the parish council were told to get rid of it.
The parish council then did put in another site, which wasn't in the local plan, for south of the railway, as a mixed housing and employment site, which wasn't in the local plan. But I mean, I think I understand that, from other evidence that the Staplehurst were generally trying to, they didn't want to diverge from the local plan. They're trying to do what the local plan was proposing for Staplehurst in terms of locations numbers, but with the odd exception. So, I mean, it sounds to me as if what likely happened is that the neighbourhood plan group, having kind of adopted that policy, then decided themselves that if a site was objected to by the borough council, then they won't put it in. You know, I mean they could have put it in. They did. It doesn't seem that it was, it was against basic conditions or other terms, unless it was said on some basis not to be in general conformity with the strategy of the adopted local plan or something. But it sounds to me as if it's the parish council's decision to take it out rather than the borough council's decision. I mean, the borough council may object, but the parish council could have stuck to its guns if it wanted to.
That's certainly how it seems, sir, but I can only rely on what my clients tell me, and it's, the hand of politics in planning.
But now in a position, of course, we've got a made neighbourhood plan, which doesn't include it. And so that's where we are now. I mean, if it was put back into the local plan, then it could. The fact that it was a made neighbourhood plan doesn't mean that it couldn't go ahead. But there's still general controversy about whether you should be kind of departing from newly made neighbourhood plans, and again politically it's potentially difficult. Mr. Timms, do you have any?
Yeah, just on the neighbourhood plan, obviously it wasn't included, and I think it's worth noting in the examiner's report. I'm just getting the reference of that in the library. Right at the start, in introduction and background, paragraph 1.2, the examiner says there's virtually no built development to the north of the railway line, which remains as a development limit to the expansion of the village northwards. In terms of the planning application on the site, it was outlined, there was an illustrative layout, and it was our view that north of the railway line, it's much more sporadic, it's larger houses on big plots, and with this site, we had sort of frontage, quite dense frontage development, both going on the main road, much more dense than to the north, and also down George Street, which is a particularly rural lane with no built development at all. So It's just, one, yes, it's north of the railway line, but two, I just think that this is not in keeping with what limited development there is north of the railway line.
Well, the fact of the matter is, sir, that the site was in accordance with the then neighbourhood plan. Following that, the council have granted permission. The council has granted permission for business development within the site. We were going to put it in as a single comprehensive proposal, but we then split it. So there was one application for the housing element and one application for the business unit, because my clients wanted a mixed development. The business unit has been, the business development has been granted. The residential development has been refused. Mr. Timms mentioned access.
The business by conversion rather than new builds.
Yes,
yeah.
Yes. Mr. Timms has mentioned highways. No objection from the Highways Authority. And I think, just as importantly, my clients own a considerable swathe of land there. They're only looking to develop the southern portion of it, and they can create a green buffer to the northern side of Staplehurst. But as I said earlier, there is a substantial amount of development north of the railway line in Staplehurst. It's amazing when you actually go and count the houses and count the businesses and see what's there. The railway line forms a visual line on the map, but this site is literally a stone's throw from the station and the industrial area and a variety of services. So in terms of, it is actually nearer than a number of the allocations being promoted in Staplehurst. And it also differentiates itself because this will be built by a local firm of developers, and it won't be in the hands of a big builder. I'm not criticising big builders at all, don't get me wrong, but a lot of people like choice, and I think it's fair to have a variety of sites in a village, but this will be built by a small Kent developer in competition with Bovis, Redrow and everybody else, so it'll provide choice. So I think there's an awful lot going for this. Unfortunately, it's been refused, and we will be going to appeal.
What's the area of land between the site and the railway? There's this triangular area. Is that your client's land as well, or is that somebody else's?
The land south of George Street, sir, is out with my client's control. I should have added that there is, you can go along George Street and there's a footpath at grade link straight into the railway station at the western end of George Street. So you can walk there very easily.
Mr. Timms?
Just a clarification, I don't recall saying any issues to do with highways. We don't have any highways issues with the site.
I think it just says no access mitigation requirements.
Yeah. In terms of the planning application, it wasn't grounds for refusal. And I think that under the planning application, we're looking at about 33 houses. And I think that inevitably means, as was illustrated, a road coming in, sort of cul-de-sac development, which is just entirely out of keeping with single dwellings on plots, large plots, that's further to the north. You know, and even if you had no rear access and individual driveways, again, that's not in keeping, particularly on George Street, along with the street lighting that was indicated in the planning application on George Street, which is just a rural road.
That rather begs the question, are you suggesting to my clients that they change their plans and go for large detached houses frontage along George Street?
I think you have to draw your own conclusions about that. Okay. All right. Next one then. So, keep missing these out. Right. Yalding, London Lane, Mount Avenue. So this one. It's Millwood Homes. This is the it's described as a woodland site. Let's have a look what the council said. And the council commented constraints to impact on landscape, unmanaged woodland likely to be of high ecological value, high potential for protected notable species. Public right-of-way causes the potential access to the site. And the TPO was made in October. It was a blanket TPO on the whole of the site. And there's it's described as a master plan, which is seems to be suggesting how some of the site could be retained as amenity space, or with showing areas of trees that could be retained. I can't see from here what the trees will be lost on here. It's only showing what's retained, so I don't know what the overall effect is on the trees that currently exist on the site. Okay. Okay, so Mr. Scott, do you want to explain that further, about how you think it's compatible with the trees?
Not a number of points there, sir. The council's criticism, which you read out, was the same as we had for the land at Langley this morning. It's the potential for impact there. My clients have commissioned a variety of consultants to survey the land and submit details. The plans I've shown you show that how my clients have produced a plan that do their best to really create a development of pockets of housing within the woodland rather than and to retain as much of the woodland, which is pretty poor quality stuff, I must say, but it is to retain as much of the woodland to provide not just good buffer planting and boundary, but also provide woodland within the site as well. So you have houses in pockets of development rather than substantial destruction. The other points I'd like to bring to your attention, sir, is that my clients have been promoting this for some considerable time, and back in 2009, the council considered that that in principle development could be here. It said the site was potentially suitable as a modest extension to the village and that a modest development could be accommodated here without compromising the wider countryside. And the site was given a capacity for 60 units. So taking account of local objections, my clients haven't pushed that figure of 60. They've radically reduced it down to 30 units, of which 40% will be affordable housing, and they have done so to try and get an acceptable scheme which can be a realistic and appropriate extension to a larger village. Now, within this village, within Yalding, sir, there is an allocation for 65 houses on the southern side of the road, but the parish council, through its neighbourhood plan, only want 30 to 35 houses there. So we could quite easily retain or maintain the Borough Council's figure of 65 units, 30 on my client's side and 30 to 35 on the other side of the road.
Have you any indication from the parish council that they would prefer that to having 65? Have they given any support to having 30 on this side?
They haven't supported 30 on this side. They just want less on the other side of the road. But I was looking at it from a borough council's point of view to at least retain the figures. And of course, Yalding itself is categorised as a larger village. There is just at the moment this one allocation. I don't want to get into discussion about the Syngenta site further to the west, but there is just one allocation there. I say the parish council really want that halved.
It's being proposed that the Syngenta site come out.
And at least this could create, this could maintain the quantum of development in Yalding, and I think it could do it in a very well planned, well designed site. You mentioned the TPO. We've been discussing this site or promoting this site for a long time, and it was only recently slapped on, and of course my clients have objected to it. Now, it isn't actually a killer because it is something that can be reasonably, it can be a matter of discussion, negotiation, but I think it says something for the council to suddenly slap it on at the 11th hour after an application had been submitted. But that's where we are with the council, I'm afraid. But we think it is a good site. It's certainly in a sustainable location. The council will obviously tell you that it was a special landscape area in the adopted plan. But as I said earlier, nearly a quarter of all allocated sites in the plan are special landscape area, and nearly half of them have another environmental constraint on them. So the fact it is SLA certainly isn't a killer by any means. You know, we accept difficult decisions have got to be made, but Yalding has a settlement with a fair range of facilities, and this is on the edge of it in a sustainable location.
Yeah. The appeal hearing is on the 15th of next month, so it's over 2 weeks.
Yes, sir. There was an appeal hearing, and then the Planning Inspectorate has decided to elevate written reps appeals to hearings when Maidstone announced it had a 5-year housing land supply. But since then, as I explained last week, there have been 4 appeal decisions where inspectors, including one literally 10 days ago, where the inspectors have said there isn't a 5-year supply. But that's where we are. There is a hearing in mid-December.
Mr. Timms, want to say anything?
No, it was just to say, in view of the hearing in sort of 2 weeks' time, I don't really wish to make any comments on this specific site. The only clarification is Mr. Court kept referring to the Borough Council wanting 60 on the site. Well, clearly, we've refused the planning application. That's not the Borough Council's stance for this site.
Okay. Right. R1991 East Farley. Let's get this. Where's the? Where's it gone? Lower Gallants Farm. Right. Old hop drying facility converted to warehouses and sold to the current owners 10 years ago. Now, this is... Right, it's now identified, I understand it, as a DM21 employment site. Is that right? Now, does that mean then that the policy DM4 would not apply? Because DM24, sorry, DM21, says change of use or redevelopment will not be permitted unless it's demonstrated there's no reasonable prospects of take-up or continued use for employment in the medium term. Mixed-use proposals may be exceptionally permitted. Right, and so... Unless you can meet the DM21 criteria, then the DM4 provisions for redevelopment of brownfield land in the countryside won't apply, as I understand it. Is that how it's meant to work? Yeah. You have to meet DM21 first. If you meet DM21, then you can test, and if it's a site in the countryside, you can test it against DM4. And in particular, the environmental and sustainable location provisions of that policy. So so I take it then this is a site which is in active employment use?
Yes, sir. It's a site that is part brownfield, warehousing, and part greenfield. It is in active employment use, and it is one of those sites that we believe can come forward in several years' time. It's not a case of an immediate development job. There is a tenancy agreement, there is a lease on the warehouse, which runs for another 5 or 6 years, but thereafter things could change. I must say that we were very surprised when the council decided to identify this as an important industrial site to be preserved. That designation only came in this year. I can understand the need to preserve industrial estates and industrial outlets, commercial outlets, employment outlets. I'm fully in agreement with that. But to impose that policy on this site was simply a method to prevent its redevelopment. I cannot think why the council would wish to retain these 2 warehouses in a location that don't lend themselves to economic use, commercial development. This is on the south side of Maidstone. You've got to get across East Farley or Teessam Bridge to get to the motorway network. And we will recall what Helen Grant said a week ago about the problems of traffic congestion and the accessibility of Maidstone. So I was very surprised why the council first of all decided to designate this site. I must say the council has difficulty dealing with brownfield sites. The good ones have gone. The remaining brownfield sites are often in rural areas. I remember watching the council's discussion on the allocation of, I think, the Bentlet site allocation at Laddingford, which is an old industrial site in the countryside. And I understand the problems that they face with what to do with brownfield sites, because there are, in my estimation, there are no nice brownfield sites left on the edge of Maidstone or on the edge of a village. They are all, I wouldn't say in the middle of nowhere, but in, I accept, locations with limited sustainability. What do you do with them? This one, as I say, I'm very surprised that the council sought to protect it, because if the current operation ceases, I'm not sure who would actually want a commercial site here, because when you've got lorry traffic, you've got to get across the Medway onto the A20, M20 for much of your business.
Well, isn't that when the DM21 criteria kick in then, though? Because if the present use does cease, and then you can show that no one else is going to use it for employment purposes because of these disadvantages, then you've got the possibility of alternative use. But until that time, as long as people do, it is a premises that employers will use, then it's available for them to use, and it's protected from other uses, and you've still got employment land in the rural areas.
Yes, I accept that point, sir, but the point I was making was that I was very surprised that they slapped this retention policy on the site in the first place after we'd had a pre-application meeting to discuss its development, and where we were told that in principle the redevelopment of the built half of the site was a realistic prospect. All right, the officer was concerned about the greenfield element of the site, but I don't know if you've seen it, but it is very, very well secluded indeed by buffer planting to the east, to the west and to the north. It is a very secluded site, so the visual impact of development there will be extremely limited indeed.
I mean, only about a quarter of the site seems to have buildings on it. On your plan.
I would suggest. I wouldn't argue with you, sir, but I would suggest. Well, I see what you mean. Yes, the buildings are shown on that plan, yeah. But what I call the southern half of that site is surface car park. Right. That southern half is solid brown field. I can assure you. But it's used for parking all of the lorries.
Okay. Yes. Well, I don't think. I'm not convinced there's a reason to take it out of GM21. To this stage, because it does allow for the circumstances that you describe, in which users cease and no one else will take it. Okay, so move on then. Dean Street, East Farley. And at Frith Cottage. Okay, this is yes. I was noted that you've said this is greenfield being part of the curtilage of my client's house. There is this. I don't know if you had a discussion earlier in the examination about this, and that there's this. There's been these court decisions essentially saying that the definition of or the exclusion of garden land as brownfield development only applies literally within settlements, and so that garden land within curtilage of a building outside a settlement can be brownfield. And as we had this discussion in relation to the policy DM4, in which there's likely to be a change to that, so that it excludes garden land in the countryside from that brownfield well, not from brownfield definition, because you can't do that, but from the application of that policy. I mean, it's something that I think no one had appreciated until the courts looked more closely at the wording of the. And I don't think the government intended that was as how it should be defined. But and that's been the case, and the argument is being now currently being made at appeals in various places about this. that these sites should qualify as brownfield. Okay. But essentially, this is a large garden in a kind of a hamlet outside any settlement boundaries, and just check what's in it. And I think it's not so much as seeking allocation as it's really part of your evidence about the policy about development of infill sites in the countryside generally. That this is an example of the sort of sites which would be affected. Is that the case?
Yes, sir. This is a particularly interesting site because it is symptomatic of problems that are facing so many people today. Mrs. Horn is owned by my client, Mrs. Horn, who has a 30-year-old daughter living at home, and like so many people say to me, where on earth are my children going to live? How can they afford something? Where are they going to live? And the situation we have here is that my client has a house with a fairly large curtilage. She has the capacity to construct a house to provide for her daughter, but planning policy is against it. Now, back in the adopted local plan, there was what I thought was a very sensible policy, H29, that provided a degree of flexibility to the council and to landowners to permit development in otherwise developed frontages. And I thought that was an eminently sensible policy, and it was a shame that it was lost. But what we have here is it's not a village, but Dean Street. You have Dean Street, you have East Farley, you have West Farley together, and they are a very short distance from Cox Heath, which is one of the larger villages as well. And the point I made earlier this morning in respect of the Langley site is that the PPG shows how old I'm, the NPPF says that developments can go ahead in villages without a good array of services where they can perhaps support each other. So a bit of development here and a bit of development there. And as I also said, and it'll apply to the next site as well, the Borough Council has got basically a blanket refusal on sites that are out with either the rural service centres or the larger villages, to the effect that you have places like Dean Street, East Farley, Teeson, Grafty Green, Laddingford, not Laddingford, but others, where there is no development at all. And here is an ideal opportunity for my client to actually provide for a member of her family to get on the housing ladder, but at the moment, I don't think it will be permitted. I also have to say that the council has an inconsistent approach towards development outside defined built-up areas. I did an application earlier this year for a site some way outside Headcorn, between houses. Had a pre-application meeting. The council officer thought it was eminently sensible. There was houses to the south, there were houses to the north, there were houses on the other side of the road, and southwest was a large barn. Permitted, it went through without a problem. Not far from there, I had a client who wanted to build another house within his curtilage. It was actually a builder's yard. It was a brownfield site. Having been told by the planning officer it was all fine, the council decided to refuse it. And yesterday, sir, we won the appeal on it. So the council is inconsistent. When somebody comes to me, as a lot of people do, and say, I've got this plot of land, what can I do with it? You automatically look to see where it is in relation to a village, and if it's outside a built-up area, the answer is, I'm not sure. You get one planning officer that says, this is a reasonable proposal, another one that refuses it. So here, I think the plan should have a policy that with restraints, I'm not saying we have a free-for-all situation at all, but where you have a collection of houses, then building in a gap, perhaps even self-build or some form of starter home development. But, I mean, here the situation is that Mrs. Horn wants a house for her daughter. That may not apply in all cases, but, I mean, we were Mr. Jarman and I were having a casual conversation about the government's starter home policy, and we weren't quite sure where it was going. So there seems to be something here that is very difficult to grab hold of, because I haven't got a draft starter home policy for you. But I think you can understand where I'm coming from, or where my client is coming from, about the frustration of having land but being unable to build on it. We aren't in the middle of nowhere. And you also have to bring into the consideration the government's change in regulations on barn conversions. Almost by definition, they are in rural areas some way from anywhere, but the government is happy for those to be converted to houses, subject to certain constraints. But where you've got a plot of land in a substantially built-up frontage, the council will say no. Yet we need housing, we need starter homes. Here we have the facility, my client has the facility to provide a house for her daughter, who's 31 and still living at home, and it can't. So I find this a very interesting subject to discuss, sir.
Yeah, I mean, we've moved on to kind of issue 3 on the agenda, which is whether the lack of this infill policy, or lack of policy to permit infill housing development in the countryside renders the plan unsound. Now, I asked, you referred to policy H29, and that's an old policy, and the council's clarified that that's ceased to be part of the development plan 9 years ago now, in September 2007, when it wasn't saved by the Secretary of State. Now, I asked why the plan might now be unsound without a policy. And you suggested it would meet it would provide a contribution to meet housing needs. Now that's, okay, for the plan to be unsound, okay, so you first need this conclusion that there isn't sufficient supply, that you need other contributions to supply, of which, infill in small villages or places potentially could be a contribution. But that rather depends on first of all, concluding that there isn't sufficient supply. I wonder, if that is, if were the route you're going down, how would you start to assess what contribution to supply you might make from these sort of developments? Is it 100? Is it 1,000? Is it, what is it? How do you forecast what numbers there might be?
I'm not able to forecast it, sir. The point I'm making is that outside rural service centres and larger villages, there is pretty well a blanket ban on any housing at all. Now, as I said earlier, Maidstone's strategy, as far as it goes, is logical. It's in keeping with others, that you concentrate on the main town, you then look at the next tier of small towns or villages and you allow expansion there. You then go down to the larger villages, expansion there, fine. Then there's a cut-off. You've got Maidstone, I think you've got the 5 rural service centres and the 5 larger villages, and that's it. And there's this whole array of settlements where no potential at all. And that seems to be fundamentally wrong. I think there is, and I genuinely believe there is a need for more housing. And it seems that with a flexible policy akin to policy H29, you could get development in an array of places. I'm not asking for an open house situation, to speak. There must be constraints and controls. We're not talking about building in the AONB. I think we have to be careful about SLA as well. But outside areas that are subject to what are called genuine or strong constraints, can there not be a degree of development which can provide either for local people, either starter homes, self-build, something there? I haven't got a written policy I could give you, sir. I've thought about this. I'll be honest, I've struggled to come up with a form of words.
Well,
I thought by at least having a discussion about it, we could perhaps try. I think you understand the direction in which I'm going, and it's fine. Well, maybe reinstatement of H29 would be the easiest thing.
I mean, there is a... well, I haven't got a copy of H29, so I don't know what it says at the moment. I mean, starter homes you can have under local needs housing policy, because local needs housing does allow for affordable housing outside settlements. So there is some scope to have starter homes out to local needs housing.
But this specific situation would be where my client could provide for her daughter, and I'm not sure if you're saying, or the council would say, well, you've got to have an affordable needs survey first. I mean, they've got to be very carefully vetted. It isn't a case of let's build a house, a starter home, and put it out there for sale, so to speak. But there is certainly a problem with a lot of people having the property or the land to be able to provide for their children, but the planning policies don't support them. So that is the conundrum which we've
Of course, what with starter homes is the way they've been set up so far. They won't necessarily be retained permanently. There's affordable housing. I mean, I've always thought that there's some potential merit in having schemes that, if you are going to allow housing in the countryside, whether it's agricultural dwellings or whatever, that you then they go on to remain part of the affordable housing stock. If instead of simply being released back to the market when there's no longer need for agricultural dwelling. If they become affordable dwelling and people have to qualify under that in the future, then that would be a way of keeping some supply in the countryside. But it is difficult. I mean, is there a copy of H29 around that? I can see. I mean, obviously there's a reason that H29 was not saved in 2007.
Yeah, the policy H29. Was quite a popular policy in that it said infilling would be allowed in the countryside. And infilling was defined, I think, as a narrow gap capable of accommodating one or two houses, from memory. And then...
Well, I'll read it out just for the benefit. So, outside the defined urban areas and village boundaries, planning permission for infilling, that is, filling of a small gap in an otherwise built-up frontage, or for minor extensions of small groups of houses, well, that's something else again, will not be granted if the proposal would extend rural settlements into the open countryside. It's a slightly odd way to do it, isn't it? Yes. So is it... It's rather oddly expressed because it's saying what will not be allowed rather than what will be allowed. So I'll reread that again, just a minute. Outside the defined urban areas and village boundaries, planning permission for infilling, that is, filling of a small gap in otherwise built-up frontage, or for minor extensions of small groups of houses, will not be granted if the proposal would extend rural settlements in the open countryside. I mean, you'd expect it to say that planning permission will be granted for minor infilling and settlements, but will not be granted if you... I think in any case, I don't think that it's very well worded to reintroduce in that case. I mean, there used to be this thing, it was a PPG 7, I think, about, which is probably contemporary with, it's not PPS 7, PPG 7, about infilling, and it's something that I think the major government has kind of reintroduced, and probably around at the time the last local plan was Dr. Still. And then people got much more interested about sustainable travel and things, and they concerned about these.
From memory, like you were saying, I think PBG7 did include specific reference to infilling, but PBS7 did not because of, I wouldn't say it was the beginning of sustainability, but there was much more emphasis on sustainability. I mean, if it helps, obviously, the main reason why obviously a new policy would have to be written in the positive. But the main reason why we haven't got a 2016 infilling policy is because of this sustainability. You know, as Mr. Court has pointed out, we have got this hierarchy. But that's not to say that we would never grant planning permission for any redevelopment or infilling. As I pointed out earlier in the examination, it very much depends on whether or not there's material harm to the character and appearance of the countryside. And there is a question mark about whether or not there's a sustainable location.
But there isn't actually a policy which says that. I mean, you've got there isn't a policy which says we can have infilling as long as it doesn't harm the countryside and as long as it's sustainably located. So which may be why Mr. Court is suggesting that you get inconsistent results on these sort of proposals.
I think, like one of our previous discussions at the examination, there's many potential exceptions to the rule. Yes, there's infilling, there's redevelopment, there's arguably sort of bad neighbour uses like dog kennels where you obviously you wouldn't want them close to people's houses, or ideally you wouldn't. And the list goes on.
But when it comes to a policy to allow housing in the countryside, it's rather uncertain what the kind of outcome of that could be. If you've got an area with lots of little kind of pockets and hamlets of houses and developed over many years with gardens of all different sizes and different relationships, there might be lots and lots of places where you suddenly get a lot more infill development, or that might not be the experience of when the policy was in operation before. There may have been the exceptions, and it's very uncertain of what outcome you'd have from a policy like this. And how what you'd need in any case would be a policy. In fact, actually, I just noticed it refers to PPG7 before the policy here. What becomes quite important is what criteria policy would have. We haven't really got a draft of anything before us. And I said I think there are issues with the way policy H29 was worded. Mr. Chairman.
To my mind, we have got a clear strategy. We have got a clear hierarchy. So normally, I know we don't use that term anymore, but most of this type of development would be unsustainable.
Are you talking specifically about transport then, or?
Transport, I guess transport access to everyday services. On a very strategic level, as you pointed out, Maidstone's got a lot of this type of development. I wouldn't want to see all of these sort of hamlets become consolidated.
Can I just add, I think Mr. Court had said that the hierarchy stopping at the larger villages was wrong, and I just can't see where in the MPPF it's saying that this infill development is permissible. It says at paragraph 55, housing should be located where it enhance, maintain vitality of rural communities. for example, where there are groups of smaller settlements, development in one village may support services in a village nearby. I don't think that means one dwelling in an infill in a poor location. So I don't think it's wrong that there's not a policy allowing for it, and I can't see where the NPPF is pointing us towards that.
Ms. Courts, are you suggesting that there's an inconsistency with the NPPF, and if so, what?
Paragraph 55 is the one that Mr. Timms has referred to, sir, and I think it is one of those paragraphs that we can all read and perhaps come up with different ideas about. It sets a broad guideline to local authorities to address this issue, and I'm afraid Maidstone hasn't. In fact, we've had two inconsistent answers from Mr. Jarman. When he first spoke, he did acknowledge that there were opportunities for development, maybe a single dwelling or a couple of dwellings outside defined built-up areas, depending on the circumstances. And then he's just said we have a clear hierarchy, most of this type of development would be unsustainable. Now, I've got a fairly extensive experience of promoting these sites. I've told you about a couple already. I've currently promoted a car repair and sales facility on the edge of a line of houses and has been told, no, it's unsustainable. Well, there we've actually got a brownfield site that's not far from a village. I admit it's outside the village envelope. It's a site that I think could reasonably go. It is brownfield. It's no longer wanted. And we're told, no, we can't have that. I promoted a brownfield site, a fairly extensive one, and was told, we don't want development here, but you can have those two barns converted under the new change of use rules. And I said, well, what about the rest of the site? No, it's unsustainable, but you can have two houses there. I mean,
yeah, but that's what, as permitted development?
It's under the permitted development rules that they wouldn't allow the whole load of sheds with God knows what's going on.
I mean, the council is not allowing that in that case.
No, it doesn't know what to do with brownfield sites. And I say this single dwelling I was talking about at the village of Oldcombe on a car repair yard, no, you can't have that. So they don't like brownfield development outside built-up areas, and they don't like greenfield development outside built-up areas. But Mr. Jarman did say when he first spoke, there are situations where you can have it. I got permission on one, and I've just won an appeal on the other. But I cannot tell any client what their prospects are, and often it depends which planning officer you speak to. So we need something here to deal with this problem of providing homes for, well, homes for anybody, but homes for the young, starter homes. And the council, I think, is being very negative about it, rather than grasping, I think, a difficult nettle. But there is no policy there to say how you can get development outside built-up areas, which is a fundamental flaw in the plan.
Mr. Chairman.
As I said before, one of the tests is impact on character and appearance of the countryside, and that was very much to the focus with the old policy H29.
So one of the tests, what you're talking about is SP17?
Sorry, I was just going back sort of strategically in terms of tests, whether or not residential development in the countryside is acceptable. And in my view, H29 was sort of rooted in impact on, mainly on impact on character and appearance to the countryside. However, as I said previously, then, particularly with PPS 7, you had, I wouldn't say a new test, but another test came to the fore, and that's sustainability, particularly sustainable location. Obviously, the main plank of our strategy is this, what we regard as a sustainable hierarchy. And I don't see that being that different in fact, I see it very well aligned with paragraph 55, which I totally disagree with Mr. Court. Paragraph 55, again, it's not the easiest of subjects, tries to pick out exceptions to the rule. Paragraph 55 states, to promote sustainable development. I think that's the bit Mr. Court doesn't like, is sustainable development in rural areas. And then picks out exceptions to the rule, like rural workers needing to live close to their place of work, innovative houses in terms of design, etc.
Just a minute. Let's have a quick look at that. I mean, in your representation of this court, you're talking about this, and you said again this morning about its provision for allowing relatives. As you say, policy should be included in the plan stating that outside defined built-up areas, but otherwise developed frontages, small-scale residential infill development should be permitted. And particular support will be given to proposals where the dwelling is to be occupied by a relative of the landowner. Again, you haven't suggested any wording, and I'm not sure how you would define a relative. And if you do have a relative, say for example, this is the case you're talking about, where someone has a daughter, they want to build a house in the garden for the daughter, and then in 3 or 4 years' time, the daughter decides to move on, get married, whatever, and puts a house just on the general market, and that's it. I mean, it's only served that purpose for a very short time, if at all. And it does create potentially, quite a big loophole if you simply say a relative. It could be the brother or the sister or any, or you could just use you could create a case, which might not be a genuine case at all, for just someone saying, "Oh, well, I want grandma to come and live with me, so I think we should build a house next door." And then, but in practice, she actually she goes to a care home or something. There are all sorts of ways in which that sort of seems that provision could be abused, unless you can have a very precise, a very clear wording, exactly who is affected, and conditions, what they have to do, and how long they have to stay there, and what happens to the house afterwards, and all sorts of things, which all create all kinds of problems, and it's very difficult to do if you haven't got some kind of draft provision to start with.
I fully accept your point, sir. What I'm doing here is, through one case, articulating a problem that has been brought to my attention by numerous landowners over numerous years. And I thought, well, this is an opportunity to have a discussion. And I put my hands up. I haven't got an idealised policy. But I thought by at least having a discussion, you could at least appreciate the problem that exists. Or I'm sure you're aware of that already. And try to work with the council and indeed ourselves to come up with some, I'll call it crudely, a replacement H29 policy, but some form of policy that allows people to provide houses outside defined built-up areas where there is a specified need. I accept your point. You grant permission here, daughter moves in, 2 years later she goes and gets a job in Manchester, gets married, boom, you've got a house. I accept that point, but at least we're getting over the problem of providing homes for those that genuinely need them. I note that Mr. Jarman talks about his concern about the impact and character, on the character and appearance of the countryside. That is a genuine issue, but I would be worried that that could be used absolutely anywhere. I must disagree with him on my approach to paragraph 55. I am not against sustainable development. I mean, that was, quite honestly, that was a silly thing to say. I appreciate the problem that almost by definition, anything outside the larger villages you can claim as unsustainable. But you then look at some of the allocations, Bentlett's Yard, in an unsustainable location. That's what a lot of your councillors were saying. There is no easy answer. You've either got to use brownfield sites where they are, or you've got to accept that some development will be unsustainable. Let's be honest, we all know people who will drive their kids 400 yards to school when it's raining, as one example. Because somebody lives quite close to something, it doesn't mean to say they won't use their car. That is a fact of life. So I support the concept of sustainable development, but you can't just say, well, that site is unsustainable, that site is. It all depends on the use of that building by the person involved. I
mean, that's something that the planning authority can't control. That all the planning authority can do is provide the opportunity to use sustainable travel and so on. And you can't force people to actually do it. And there may be ways to encourage people to do that more. But if housing simply develops in locations where there isn't the opportunity, then and they have to use the car for every journey, then that's a different matter.
Well, you have situations like this where you do have public transport. I mean, this site is in walking distance of Cox Heath. There are bus routes there. It's sort of how you wish to define how sustainable is sustainable. I mean, there is no finite checklist that if you're within X hundred metres of a post office, you're okay, and if you're within Y 100 metres, you're not, because every village has got a whole variety of...
The sustainability appraisal does exactly that. But, okay. Right, there's one more matter because I want to deal with. I don't think we can really take that any further. Issue 4 is whether the lack of a policy to encourage self-build development renders a plan unsound. And this is, again, another matter that you've raised. And you say that the PPF says local plan to be flexible and responsive to change. We've heard much from the government and other organisations about the need to stimulate opportunities for self-build dwellings. And the council has essentially simply ignored these calls, rendering the local plan inflexible, unresponsive to change and consequently unsound. And in response to the question of what wording would you seek a policy should be included that states that outside build-to-bears, again, so it's the same argument essentially saying that the way to provide self-build dwellings is by allowing this development in infill development and developed frontages, and it's particularly related to landowner or the need for housing in that location. The Council in its responses on the matter has pointed to its policy DM11 on the local plan, which states, in considering proposals for new housing development, the Council will seek a sustainable range of house sizes, types and tenures, including plots for custom and self-build, that reflects the needs of those living in the Maidstone Borough now and in years to come. The Council's register for custom and self-built housing plots will evidence demand and will support pre-application discussions with developers. And then it says that as of this month, 142 individuals have registered interest in the Maidstone local self-build register, although it notes that only 12 reside in the borough. And there's a preference for single self-build plots and/or plots on small developments, in suburban or rural locations, or some will consider an urban location. 86% would consider a plot within a large mainstream housing development. 3 housing associations have registered to date, 2 of which have registered in all local authority areas in the South East, did not cite Maidstone as a preference. All 3 would consider building within larger mainstream housing. There's there's one thing that come up, and I just, I mean, I'm not sure how that's you then get from that position of this interest in self-built housing to how you negotiate with developers to provide sites. That I did notice. I think it's an authority in Devon, which has introduced a policy requiring 5% self-built plots on all housing developments. I mean, is that something? Is that something which could be considered or might be justified, or I mean, how do you actually get a developer? Say, if Bovis Homes or someone comes along, say, how do you persuade them to say, well, we want some of these plots to be self-built?
If picking on Bovis Homes, if the register was showing that there was significant interest in solely Maidstone, then yes, I would be mentioning it to Bovis Homes as part of any pre-application discussions, as I would do the mix with 1 bed, 2 beds, affordable units, etc.
I mean, I suggesting that the self-build register so far, but maybe still early days, is not. I mean, you think weight should only be given to people who are specifically seeking local government to build for themselves, rather than people who might be providing opportunity for others to build for themselves. I mean, think like the housing associations, because you have different forms of self-build. You have obviously the grand designs type projects, and then you have the housing associations helping people to get into the housing market by contributing their own labour to build houses, which are kind of different parts of the market, really. I wonder how you translate that need into a specific policy which you can then kind of defend at appeals and things if it's resisted.
Yeah, I guess what I was trying to say is that I don't think to date there's a clear and strong demand for self-build plots to mean a sort of bespoke policy as suggested by Mr. Cord. Sorry, sir. As you alluded to, in pre-application discussions, as we would make reference to the self-build register. It wouldn't be something we would hide. There'd be some discussion around it.
Ms. Court, is the answer for you to encourage your clients to register themselves?
No, sir, because the clients have the plot of land available, as is the situation here, and want to be able to build on it. It's not a case of register somewhere.
But it might be. I mean, if the council is relying on evidence that there is a need for self-built plots, then maybe if your client says they have a plot, okay, but they can't get permission for it, but they would self-build if they could, or if they thought they'd get permission.
Yeah.
Basically, they need to register their interest in the self-build register, so the council then has a body of evidence. We've got all these people who are desperate to build their own houses, and then you can think about, well, how do we meet that? And you then get to a position that, well, one way to meet it may be to allow people in some circumstances to build on their own plots in small villages or whatever it is. But you need to really some kind of evidence of what the need is, and before you can decide how you're going to meet it. And if it's simply the case that you've got people, these frustrated people, which are probably the people who kind of write to their MPs and so on and say, we'd love to contribute to housing supply and so on, but the council won't let us by building our own house. Then that gets into the government policy. The government says, well, why aren't we encouraging self-built houses? Councils should encourage self-built houses, but you get into this kind of circle, which is kind of broken at the moment. Because this potential source of supply of self-build isn't getting into the system.
That's absolutely right, sir. Basically, when you're approached by a client who has faced with the situation here, they want to know, can I get permission for a house there, yes or no? And whilst you're absolutely right to go through the proper processes of registering the desire for self-build, they will simply say, look, can I put a planning application in? I don't really want to register on a self-build proposal until and wait till Mr. Jarman has got 50 or 100 names on the list when he's prepared to go for a review of policy. Going back to one of the earlier points you made about, or what I've said here, councils should be, local plans should be flexible and responsive to change. Well, I've already told you, how many years, well, it was 10 years ago that the last plan expired, so that's where we are. We don't have a flexible system in Maidstone at all. I appreciate the point that you can register, but people want to know now, I've got a problem, my child, my 20-year-old, 30-year-old is living at home, can I put a planning application in there even if I build the house, yes or no? They don't really think long term because the problem is with them. The problem is actually living with them. I don't mean that in a prejudicial approach.
Yeah, but isn't this what the government is saying? Is how they want to go forward? The government is saying that the way we establish the need for the self-build and so on is to create these registers, and that gives you the size of the problem. And then, for example, the council members can be shown this thing, saying we've got 500 people in Maidstone Borough want to build their own houses or something, and when one of your clients' applications comes before them, then they'll take it into account that they've got this pent-up demand of people for self-building.
I accept that point, sir. I still think we would, my clients would be frustrated by Mr. Jarman's approach that it is an unsustainable location. I'm sure he would say that, well, if there's 100 people, we'll go and speak to a major developer. And having worked for 3 major developers, including the one mentioned here, I know full well what their response is to a council saying, can we have 5% of your houses for self-build? The answer is a huge no. They wish to be in control of the site. There are design criteria, and often having bought land for large developers, you cannot sell it on unless you get the landowner's permission. They want to sell to Bovis, to Barratt, to Taylor Wimpey, and there are often constraints in contracts to sell on. And the builder, the volume builder, is creating a scheme with the Borough Council that comprises his own house types, his own marketing, and then to go and have to sell a chunk of it to a group of, I was going to say inexperienced, non-professional builders, although they'd obviously employ professions. To sell them on to self-build is anathema, and I speak from having worked for builders and the House Builders Federation. I know exactly how the big companies think. If they wish to contradict that, then please let them say so. But I don't see that happening at all. I really don't. Yeah,
but that might be why you need a policy like this Devon Council has, rather than simply something which is brought up in discussions about housing mix and the pre-application discussion, which a developer who takes that attitude is likely to brush that off. Yeah. A policy would may be more effective, but to justify putting it into policy, you need to have a better evidence really of how much of this sort of development is actually needed in what locations.
No, I just see this being spiked on the ground of sustainability or lack of sustainability. So you've heard it. From...
Yeah, but on sustainability, because we had the same thing came up with permitted development conversions in the countryside, in that the first round of proposals for bar conversions and so on, a high proportion of those were being refused on sustainability grounds because of things like what paragraph 55 was saying about isolated homes in the countryside. And the government reacted to that and said, basically, that is not a reason to turn these proposals down. So there was some sympathy in the government to that sort of issue, and I think the government sees that the permitted development conversions as one way of getting some more supply in the countryside outside settlements and so on. So, it doesn't necessarily, and without the harm to character and appearance that new development might cause, because you've already converted existing building. Let's check here. Right. Yeah. But I think essentially it's a similar problem that how you, if you're using justification for a kind of infill policy, the problem again is how you define what self-build is in this case, because it's easy enough to define it if it's a case of someone using their own labour to build their own house, but if it's if self-build is someone commissioning a builder to build a house, something that it could be anybody, or and it's not necessarily building for occupation, they could be building for sale, or it's like any other development at the end. And I can't at the moment. Well, again, nothing's been suggested as a particular form of words and to support that, and I can't actually see at the moment a workable way of defining that as an exception. Just say that self-build on infill plots is acceptable, whereas other forms of development might not be, because I think really all the infill plots on rural areas could be classified as self-build. Certainly if you're building single houses. Okay, I think that's everything. Let's just check back quickly. Yeah, the only other thing I just want to deal with finally is you brought at this point about development in one village supporting services in a nearby village. We've got we have the situation in for example, some neighbourhood plans. It came up last week in Yelding, where the neighbourhood plan is keen to be able to allow development in outlying parts of the parish, which may look to the main village for their services. And there's some discussion that a neighbourhood plan might be able to do that I think this was Laddingford again, wasn't it? They're stressing that in spite of these smaller settlements not being in the local plan hierarchy, there may be an opportunity for a neighbourhood plan to say, well, actually, we want some development. Because neighbourhood plans are quite interested in small sites and 2 and 3 houses and things like that, and if they can put them in, because they get lobbied by people in the villages to promote them. So there may be one way in which you can get some development in smaller settlements, but it would have to be with kind of local support, the parish council, and all the rest of it. And that may be a small part of the solution, and promoting these sites to enable plans from the local plan. Okay, I think that's everything. Just to check. Oh, yeah, sorry, just one thing. Made some comments about, back to issue 2 on the agenda we didn't fully cover, which is policy SB 17. And a couple of points you made, Mr. Court, about SB 17. You're talking about the policy creating a blanket ban on development in the Medway Valley. This is because of policy SB 17. Sorry, 6, criterion 6, which I think is the local landscape value, isn't it? Yeah. So these areas of local landscape value, and SB 17 in the submitted plan. Where's it gone? As the Greensand Ridge, Medway Valley, Len Valley, Luce Valley and Low Weald, as defined in the policies map, will be conserved, maintained and enhanced where appropriate as landscapes of local value. And you suggested that means there's a blanket ban on development in the Medway Valley, which is consistent with the NPPF. Is that what that says?
I think this objection may have been written in respect of the site we've just, recently been talking about at Lower Gallants Farm, East Farley, which is in the Medway Valley. So, I see that as a policy that could be used to impose a blanket ban. It allows the Borough Council to say, this site is in the Medway Valley, end of story. That's all. It's, and whatever you do to perhaps provide buffer planting or some form of shielding. I mean, I did make the point that in respect of the Lower Gallants Farm site, the area behind the warehouses was very well contained indeed by a very, very strong tree boundary. But with this policy, it would allow the council to refuse it if they didn't like it. And having had a pre-application meeting there where it was almost a thumbs up for the use of the existing brownfield element, but certainly a thumbs down for the greenfield element. That's really the reason I see this as having the potential to be used as a blanket ban. I know every site is different, but I was thinking about the Lower Gallants Farm site when I was objecting to that.
There's been a proposed change to that wording, which would be to say the distinctive landscape character of the Greensand Ridge, Medway Valley, etc., as defined in the policies map, will be conserved and enhanced where appropriate as landscapes of local value. It isn't simply saying that within those areas you simply conserve and enhance them. It's more specific to a landscape criterion, essentially for those areas, which is what you'd expect. And there are, as has been pointed out previously, there are allocations in places within the landscape's local value, which suggests that it isn't intended to ban development, but you do need to take account of landscape impacts specifically in those areas. Okay, thanks very much. We'll resume at 2 o'clock then with the 13B. Do you have something else, Mr. Court? Hang on, we've got one left, have we? I missed one. Sorry. Yes, sorry, we'll deal with it now. Sorry, yes, we've got into that, sidetracked into that decision. So this is land relation to Barham Court, Teston. And the, look. Where's this thing gone? Where's that gone? Just looking for the Right, this is a larger site in the countryside. The council's particular issues with this relate to impact on landscape, potential for moderate ecological impacts, tree preservation order on part of the site, potential archaeological impacts. The site comprises wall gardens formerly associated with Grade 2 listed building within the Teston Conservation Area, and a historic parks and gardens survey will be required. Okay. The proposal is for a two-phase residential development to the north of the Barham Court buildings, and addition of land to provide extension to the churchyard, and also land for recreation and open space. Okay. Court and the two parcels of land, one is 0.8 hectares, the other is 4.1 hectares. And the open space will be 12.6 hectares, and will be given to the Borough Parish Council as open space. Are these that large, is it? Are those correct, the site areas? Yeah, I'm just wondering if it's... They seem rather large.
I must admit, I've taken this over from somebody else, so I used the information that was passed on to me without checking it. But basically...
Because the council's talking about a site of 0.32 hectares instead of 4.9 hectares. It seems it's a rather large difference.
I accept that. I think, sir, we can probably proceed on talking about the principles here,
yes,
rather than the actual site details, if you're happy with that. I do, as I say, I haven't checked these, and they were passed down to me by the previous consultant before he, well, as he retired. So that's the position I'm in, I'm afraid.
Yeah, it's huge. I just wonder if it's just acres rather than hectares. Yeah.
I can check that, sir.
Yeah, okay. I don't think you've given a number of dwellings, have you, or not?
No, I mean, basically, sir, I'm acting for the landowner here who has a substantial swathe of land. He has told me that he wants two parcels to be developed for housing, one short-term and one longer-term. He'd like a parcel to go to the church and a large chunk of land, which actually includes the Teeston Cricket Ground, to go to the Parish Council or the Borough Council in perpetuity for recreational or some similar form of use. But in order to give this land away, he wants, an element of development, and that's basically it.
Potentially quite a large amount of development. I was thinking, look, comparing it to the other housing nearby. And obviously, again, in the countryside location outside any defined settlements, and in a settlement with few services, I would take it.
Teesson does have a fair array of services, so we can always argue about how many you have to be a sustainable location. But this really goes back to the point I was making earlier, that below the large villages segment, there's a whole range of small villages, hamlets, call them what you like, where no development is allowed at all. Here my client is on the edge of a reasonably sized village and is looking for a degree of development in return for gifts to the church and the community.
I mean, if you're saying that development in one village supports development in others, you don't need to kind of identify what the other villages you're supporting. You know.
No, I haven't done that, so I'm making a general point. Yes. I mean, this village is actually right on the western boundary of Maidstone. The Tunbridge and Malling border is just a short distance to the west. But it is still the general, and of course it's on the main road, bus route to Maidstone, etc., etc. So it is an accessible village, certainly.
Okay, but there's a lot of kind of environmental issues potentially on this for the councillors.
Well, it's identified as within a huge conservation area, but in my opinion, sir, the fact that you are within a conservation area isn't an absolute killer, provided you can design things carefully. In fact, there's a lot of lovely developments take place in conservation areas, and this is why my client has agreed to, I think, distinctly limit the amount of housing that he is prepared to take, certainly as the first phase. So it's got to be within keeping.
I mean, the council's got a figure of 10 houses. Is that? I'm not sure where that's come from. 10 houses on 0.32 hectares. I don't know how that's been worked out. Have you had some previous discussions with the other agent about this site?
I'm not aware. I think we've potentially taken the phase 1 area on the plan, but clearly there's a second phase proposed, which is a much larger area adjoining it, but I suspect that's we've put 0.3 hectares, haven't we?
I mean, do your other comments about the sites just apply to that area, or do they apply to both phases?
Yeah, it's both. Both phases 1 and 2 are in the conservation area. They're in the historic parks and garden. So yeah, they're applicable to both. And
the original. So I take it the original part was this whole area is that all the original part for the house, but is it now in separate? Is the ownership being divided, Mr. Court? Is it?
My understanding, sir, is that my client owns the land that I've identified on the plan to you, but I believe that the much larger area could have all been part of Barham Court at one stage.
Yeah, the Barham Court's now owned separately.
Yes. Yes, that's now a flatted development and with some offices there as well. But yes, I think you're probably right that the whole curtilage of Barham Court stretched for, well, what is shown on most of this map. But my client now just controls the bits that I've the four tracts of land that I've identified for you.
Let's see what's on the. It's just on the boundary, isn't it? 17. Yeah, I mean, it looks like the conservation area is essentially Barham Court itself, isn't it? So this is it's mostly open land conservation area, plus Church Street and Court Lodge Farm. Okay, so there's... Right. And Mr Timms.
Just a point on the conservation area. I acknowledge that in some conservation areas you might be able to develop without causing an unacceptable level of harm, but this conservation area appears to be designated because it was the parks and gardens of Barham Court, and I think therefore to put a substantial amount of housing in it, I can't see how that would not cause harm to the heritage asset and the conservation area.
And doesn't that follow, Mr. Court? Because if now the significance of the area is that it was the grounds of this grand house, to actually build in what could potentially quite extensive developments in the middle of that conservation area is going to affect its character and openness quite significantly.
Barham Court itself, sir, sits in extensive grounds as it is. The second phase, I think the first phase, the proposed first phase of residential development is very modest indeed, and indeed with additional tree planting could be well concealed. The second phase of the proposed second phase of development doesn't necessarily mean that all of that land would be covered in housing. We could undertake very careful landscaping and buffer planting. This is really a plan for discussion, sir. I do believe that development can reasonably take place that close to a building such as Barham Court, but it is really a package being put forward here to provide land for the church, land for the village, and an element of housing. Those aren't hard and fast boundaries. They are really put forward for discussion. And if, for sake of argument, the council decided that a smaller area of development would be acceptable, then I'd certainly discuss that with my client and probably try to persuade him that you should go with what would be reasonable. We can operate a flexible approach here, and the land itself, I must say, isn't particularly attractive. The area I've identified for Phase 2 housing has got some old buildings on it, some forlorn-looking horses when I was there. It's not the most attractive area, I can assure you.
All right, thanks so much. I think that's all on that side. Thank you. So again, we'll resume at we'll start a few minutes late. We'll start at 2:10, just to go. Okay.